Thank you for joining us for our first episode of HeLPiNG Questions. My name is Dr. Alicia Luque, HeLPiNG Questions host. In today's episode, we'll have the opportunity to ask Professor Judy Kroll our first HeLPiNG question. Professor Judy Kroll is a distinguished professor of education at the University of California-Irvine. Judy's research on bilingualism is groundbreaking and covers a wide range of topics that go from uncovering the underlying brain and cognitive mechanisms that make bilingualism possible to better understanding the consequences that being and becoming bilingual have for the mind and brain. Please take a seat and stay with us as we get to hear more from Judy about what it means to be bilingual. Welcome, Judy, to the very first episode of HeLPiNG Questions. Thank you so much for being here with us. I must confess that we're all so excited to have you as our first guest and to be able to kick off our HeLPiNG Questions with you. Considering how much, how greatly, and how inspirationally you have contributed to help us understand better what is bilingualism, we couldn't think of a better person to ask our very first HeLPiNG question. Should we jump right in?
Sure.
Okay, well, then Judy, based on your experience, knowledge, and expertise, what does it mean to be bilingual?
Okay, first let me say just I'm very honored to be the first person doing this, and I'm not sure I know exactly what you want me to do, but I will jump right in. So what does it mean to be bilingual? I think the place to start is where we think about what we used to think it was to be bilingual. And not too long ago, I mean, it's probably in most people's recent past, what everyone thought was bilingual was someone who was born into a family where they would be bilingually exposed from birth, where they would have either one parent, one language, or they would have both parents who were bilingual, or living in a context where everyone was bilingual. And from early infancy, they would be exposed to both languages, and they would then maintain those two languages across their entire life. And what we now know is that idea about being a balanced and early bilingual is really a bit of mythology. So it's not that there aren't such humans around us, there are. But in fact, what we've learned in this last period is that bilingualism takes many, many different forms, and that bilingualism is more common in contexts where you see a home language and a societal language. You see individuals who may be monolingual until they get to school and then decide to pursue language study or are required to pursue language study. You see individuals who, by virtue of choice or by requirement, end up immigrating and end up in a context where they're living in a community where the language spoken is not the language with which they were born to and exposed to from early infancy. So we see a great deal of variation. And one of the liberating ideas about this is that really anyone who uses more than one language in their everyday life, regardless of whether they're fully proficient in both languages, is really bilingual and has some consequence of being bilingual. Their minds and brains have been affected by that experience. And I think that what's exciting in what we have learned in the last 20 years or so is that there is a great deal of flexibility in human ability to acquire language and to have our brains and minds adapt to that situation. So if we step back for a moment and consider all these variations, we need to then recognize forms of bilingualism that in the past may not have been identified as being bilingual. So we have children, for example, in the US who come to school with African-American English. And they come to school and they're given a very hard time because their English is different than the English that they're exposed to in school. And people say, oh, that's not really a language, that's not really legitimate. Well, it turns out they are actually a kind of heritage speaker because they are a heritage speaker of African-American English, and they come to school the same way a heritage speaker of Spanish comes to school and then is confronted with English. And then we see individuals who may have that sort of home language experience and come to school and have the opportunity to be in a dual language immersion context. That's pretty rare in the US, but when it occurs, it's very special because it means that we can maintain the home language. And I think one of the things that we've learned in this period of time is that the most common bilinguals are not these idealized early balanced bilinguals who have two languages from birth. They are people who have a mixed assortment of language experience and who come over the course of their lives to change context in terms of where they live, where they work, who they speak to. And what we're learning is that all of that makes a difference. So if we step back and we ask the question, what does all of this varied experience mean? It means, first of all, that we need to abandon the mythology that we have about bilingualism. We need to abandon the idea that there is some pure form of language use, and we need to accept the idea that what we see is language in its really in its full beauty of being ready to adapt to every situation in which people find themselves. And what we see is that the consequences of those adaptations tend to generally be positive. So many people think, oh my goodness, it's going to be confusing to have children be exposed to more than one language, or to have this variation of context and to be using different languages in different ways. We see bilinguals who code switch with one another, changing languages in midstream when they're speaking in one language and then switching to another language. And some people think, oh, that is really a problem. And what we know now is that it's not a problem at all, that it's actually a tremendous benefit, because what happens is that bilinguals learn some very important things about predicting what's happening in the environment around them. And what we know is that these experiences all build into a set of lifelong consequences that create resilience. In research that's being done with older adults who have been bilingual their entire lives, what we see is tremendous protections for their brain in terms of having had this experience of being bilingual. And so those of us who do research on these topics are very committed to the idea of trying to identify the context that will now tell us in more detail, just in each context, how bilingualism might manifest itself and how we might begin to understand what these contexts and consequences look like. And I think that the point here is that being bilingual includes everyone who is learning and using a second language, who is emerging as a proficient speaker, whose language use changes over the course of their life. Many people who start with a home language, which is not in the United States, if it's not English, it turns out that the predominant bilinguals in the US are heritage speakers, are speakers who learned their other language other than English at home, despite the fact that in the US there's a very strong bias for English only. And so we have to really think about what all of this means. And what we've learned is that it produces a whole variety of good consequences and important consequences, and ones that we need to work together towards communicating, both with everyone in all of the shareholders in our communities. We need to go beyond just the laboratory and the research that we do. We need to have interactions. So efforts like Bilingualism Matters, that's been spearheaded by Antonella Serratrice and at Edinburgh, has created an international network to try to talk about the issue of how we need to talk together together to understand how parents raising bilingual children and educators in schools and policymakers need to work together towards achieving this goal. But it is really, it is a wonderful moment for research and thinking about bilingualism, because we've learned, I want to say we've learned a lot, but we've only just really scratched the surface. And I think that for anyone listening to this now who is in the community and not directly involved in research, I want to invite you to think about how we need to be able to create a conversation and a discussion so that we are all working on this together.
Well, Judy, I cannot agree more with that tiny bit and everything you said. And this was absolutely fantastic. And thank you so much for, like many, many years of like committed and inspirational work and on the field of bilingualism, and for your very insightful summary. And I know a very complex topic, and also thank you for all your efforts in trying to help us better understand what it means to be bilingual. And I must say that it's been an absolute pleasure to have you as our first guest. Thank you for your generosity and for your time. Thank you.
Many thanks for having me here.
We really hope you enjoyed our first helping question, and that Judy's fascinating scientific insight and professional experience helped you to better understand what it means to be bilingual. Stay tuned for a second episode coming to you on February 15th, where we'll get to ask Professor Ludovica Serratrice, Professor of Bi and Multilingualism at the University of Reading, our second helping question. Do children get confused when you speak to them in more than one language? We look forward to seeing you all back here on February 15th. Also, don't forget to subscribe and to share with us your thoughts, feedback, and comments on any of our social media channels. Thank you for listening, and see you back here on February 15th. Bye!